All right, let's go ahead and take our seats and get started this morning. We got a quick technical glitch. We'll hold on 1 minute. Good morning. Good morning. Everything good? Excellent. Very good. Okay, let's go ahead and open up for our third and final day in beautiful Claremont. The Citizens Redistricting Commission, open session. We'll start off with a roll call this morning.
Commissioner Aguirre.
Here.
Commissioner Anchetta.
Here.
Commissioner Baraba. Here. Commissioner Blanco. Here. Commissioner Dye.
Here.
Commissioner DiGiulio. Commissioner Filkins-Weber. Here. Commissioner Forbes. Commissioner Galambos-Malloy. Here. Commissioner Ontai. Here. Commissioner Parvenu. Here. Commissioner Raya.
Here.
Commissioner Ward.
Here.
Commissioner Yao.
Here.
Thank you, Janice. I'd like to notice for the public a quorum is present, but also notice that we don't have a sufficient quorum for a supermajority votes today. At this time, let's go ahead and just check in with staff and see if there's any items that...
None at this time.
Thank you, Dan. Excellent. Then if we're prepared to open the microphone to the public to address any agendized or non-agendized item at this time, pursuant to our implementation of an earlier motion last month, we're going to ask that public comments be left to 5 minutes or less so that we can afford everybody an opportunity to speak in the limited time. Thank you.
For the record, my name is John Kopp. I'm a member of the public from Riverside County. I have to start off by saying that I normally don't like to burn bridges, and I plan to make future comments to the Commission. And so I would hope I would engender some respect when I do that. However, I have to start off by saying, well, I already started off. I have to say that I was embarrassed for the Commission yesterday on any number of reasons. And actually, as I was driving home, I was a bit angry, but it ends up being more embarrassed than angry. When I was, as I believe, improperly cut off from making public comments yesterday at the time of the Legal Advisory Committee report, I think I probably should have challenged the chair on that point. The Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act and Government Code Section 11125.7, I think, confer an absolute right on the public to make comments, and it's not for the chair to predetermine what those comments are. For all the chair knew, I could have had additional comments. I could have been commenting on the conduct of the committee meeting. And as it turns out, I had additional comments that I thought the whole commission should have been aware of that may or may not have come out from the committee report. For example, this was the Legally Advisory Committee, and I note that a number of the members of the commission are not lawyers. And the point I wanted to make was about the interpretation of the the phrase redistricting matters and the ability of the Commission to receive and make comments with the public about that. And Commissioner Filkins-Weber's comment that there's probably a need for the Commission to determine and define what that phrase redistricting matters is. And from my experience in the workers' compensation legal community, I see a number of decisions where the courts say the same thing over and over again. And one of the things that the courts say over and over again is that the way an act is administered by an agency of the state or rules are interpreted by agencies of the state is given great weight if matters should go to court. And so it's important that the Commission be aware that it define its ability to speak with and receive and give comment to the public. And so you need to be aware of that when you get to the point about defining redistricting matters and conversations with the public. The other thing was that okay. Well, I think on the opening session when I had a public comment, I noted that we're probably a tribal species and that partisanship is often a manifestation of that. And so the public set up the Commission with a weight toward engendering open discussion and cutting down on adversarial proceedings by having essentially a veto power of 2 declined to vote members could stymie partisanship. So with that said, I think if there was a picture of dysfunctional in the dictionary next to the definition of that term, maybe one of the group photos that was taken the other day might be alongside that. It just seems as though there were examples of voting on amendments and thinking they were voting on the blended motion to amend with the original motion. Motions were restated differently each time there was asked for clarification. I think maybe you need a parliamentarian, or I think we've always, well, those of us that are old enough recall the Perry Mason episodes on television where Raymond Burr asked the judge to instruct the court reporter to read back the question. Well, I think you have that access here. I may be mistaken. Time? Okay, thank you.
Any further public comment at this time? Excellent. Seeing no one approaching the mic, we'll go ahead and take it back to the panel and begin immediately with business. Our expectation is to be able to push through the rest of this agenda and adjourn by noon today. As I understand, there's a number of travel arrangements that depend on that. So first order of business is to go ahead and return back to the Outreach Committee for their continuation and completion of the Outreach Subcommittee report.
Thank you, Chairman Ward. I have 3 items that I want to talk about, but the last 2, it's really a general discussion for the whole commission, and it's outside of the Outreach Committee's report, somewhat related to, in fact, one of those is directly related to the last speaker's comment, but I want a healthy discussion on that. We can talk about that later. But,
Commissioner Ontai?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Could you pull that up? We can't hear you.
Here.
Sorry.
How's that? Wow. Okay. Better, right? The Outreach Committee, which is composed of myself, Commissioner Aguirre, Commissioners Parvenu, and Commissioners Raya, we haven't met, but that's the committee. But we have met in our subcommittee meeting yesterday. And we had a healthy discussion on the timeline, as well as a discussion with CCP as to what their specific tasks would be due in terms of outreach. But prior to that, as you recall, the Commission asked Commissioner Aguirre and myself to meet with the CCP people and try to define what community outreach means. And so Commissioner Aguirre and myself actually flew up to Sacramento and met with Sarah and Charlotte, with whom you heard their presentation yesterday. In that meeting, we helped them to define what we thought were issues that the Commission wanted to hear, and we helped them to package that presentation. So yesterday, they were there presenting that information within the parameters that we asked them to do that. So having done that, I think gave us an idea of exactly what would happen at the ground level when we go out and do public hearings. I hope that was helpful to the Commission. We also asked them to give us a detailed grocery list of all of the items that were suggested by them, so that the Commission would have the opportunity to go through those thoroughly and package together what we felt was a doable budget. So you heard that presentation yesterday. That one was very helpful. The other piece of our subcommittee meeting was the actual timeline. So if you recall, we handed out this schedule yesterday afternoon. If you can pull that out. The very first sheet, if you recall, at our meeting the latter part of last month, the Commission had asked me to put a timeline together, and I did that, and that is shown before you. So what I want to do is go through this. The first sheet is a summary sheet, and the significance of this is that it is designed around two major benchmark events. One, the receiving of the census data, which should come in March, April. And then our release, this Commission's release of its first trial map, which is suggested to be on May 23rd. And I'm going to work backwards on this schedule, on this timeline, from October to where we are today. So if you follow my thinking on this, I'll start on the bottom where we have pre-clearance review. We see that likely to happen in September, October. If I recall, 60 days was the figure that was given to us in the past. If our target date is to submit the plans on August 15th, shown there on column August, then backing up 14 days, which is required under the Bagley-Keynes Act, we would have to submit publicly that map, the final map, on July 25th. Then you see under June, July, the various regional areas that I had tentatively put down as the areas in which outreach would occur.
Commissioner Antai?
Yes.
One point of clarification. So the 14 days, I think, is calendar days. Did you just choose July 25th to be safe, or avoiding weekends, or what?
To be safe.
Okay.
Yeah. So that those numbers can be adjusted, but I wanted the Commission to start thinking in terms of 14 days public notice, followed by at least 5 days by the Commission to analyze feedback. So we've got some elbow space. So in June, July, we would be, in effect, going out to communities and asking them to give us feedback on our trial map. And I think this would probably be the most intense time in which we would be taking public testimony. If we were to allow a maximum amount of time for public input, based again on the 14-day sequence, so if you move back from the August 15th date, it actually gives us 3 alternative opportunities or dates in which the public can respond back to the maps. And if we choose to make revisions to that, that whole process would give us 3 opportunities. Does that make sense? So we're really constrained by that calendar time. So if you move backwards further, yes. No, ask questions along the way, because this is something you probably have to ask in a sequence fashion. Okay. So raise your hands.
Okay. Obviously, this schedule reflects the congressional maps, but the state map, I think we have an extra month of time. Is that correct, or is that incorrect?
No, I believe that when Proposition 20 was passed, it rotated everything back to August 15th. That's my understanding. Kurt can check, but I think we're working on an August 15th deadline for all maps.
I was just sitting here looking for the Voters First Act, which I brought with me, but I haven't put my hands on, so we can double check that. You have your copy, great.
And we can check online right now very quickly.
But that's an interesting question that Commissioner Yao raises, because part of the reason why I did this was for us to be all on the same page and to ask these questions so that we're all understanding of what timelines mean. So, as you can see, even staff is struggling with that question.
I have some questions.
Any other questions from the Commission?
Yeah, it has the congressional is at the back. I had another question. I'm sorry, were you finished? Oh.
Well, my question is, I know the August 15 day is driven by the congressional requirements, and I did not think that Prop 20 impacted Prop 11 in terms of the state requirements. But if it does, then I guess it would be good to know ahead of time.
It is good for us to know as a commission to know that. Absolutely. So while
Mr. Miller's looking that up, I had a few other questions as well. 2 questions. First, who or how did it come about that the release of a trial map would be May 23rd?
That's an arbitrary date that I plugged in for discussion.
Okay. The other question that I had is the schedule under the outreach for alternatives to trial map. You have a sequence of regions here. Was there a purpose to this sequence for the dates? In other words, you have Southern Coastal, which I'm assuming would include Los Angeles. Then you've got Inland Empire at the bottom. And what I'm suggesting is that there could be a possibility based on suggestions made that we may need to consider rearranging regions here, because if any changes were to occur, it will have a ripple effect potentially from the coast inland. So I was wondering if there was some specific reason for the manner in which the regions were outlined from top to bottom. Okay.
None whatsoever.
Mr.
What
Claypool?
I did was...
I apologize, Commissioner Huntai. Yep. However, by August 15th in 2011 and each year ending in the number 1 thereafter, the Commission shall approve 4 final maps and set forth for the Congressional, Senatorial, Assembly, and State Board of Equalization districts. So August 15th, a final deadline for all 4.
For all 4. That's very
Thank you, staff.
For us to know. Okay, we're all on the same page on that. Commissioner Filkins-Weber, the question is, it's an arbitrary distribution of those areas. I simply took the regions established from the very beginning as a starting point. Yesterday when we heard from Corinne McDonald, she suggested that we look at 9 regions, and I believe this commission adopted that. So I will then go back and group these into those 9 regions.
I was also looking at a sequence, though, and maybe as we progress, that a better sequence of where we go with the trial maps might be better based on the input we might get, such as moving and having, if we consider Southern California as a region and we're having multiple hearings, it might be best to do those in a sequence because it might have ripple effects, and then as we progress north or south, keeping the regions together, I guess. So your list here is not in any sequence as it correlates to the rest of the calendar. It's just something you'll work on as we get further input from our consultants.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly. In fact,
may I make it
yes,
one more comment?
Commissioner Yao.
Perhaps one of the milestone, or one of the events that we need to pay attention to is the decision on where to start drawing the map. In other words, there's been proposal to do it along the coast, proposal to do the District 5 as the starting point of starting the map. Maybe that would be the trigger for the scheduling that
could be. But
Commissioner...
let me go back to yesterday's meeting. We did hear from Korean, and we did have a number of board motions that were passed. And going over those motions, one of that is that we're going to have our first educational public hearing next week, right? I think it's the 26th, right? So February 26th, we're going to have our first public hearing in the Capitol in Sacramento. So that's going to be plugged into this. So as the Commission makes further concrete dates available, working with our consultants, I intend to plug that in. And the frequency question should also be plugged into this format as well. Now, this is important so that we're all on the same page, but also because the viewing public needs to know that.
Commissioner Ontai, thank you for all your work on this. This is quite an undertaking and is really the backbone of all of our work here. I'm wondering if you can talk more about the timing of the 3 possible alternatives or modifications to the trial maps. Is that, again, based on the premise that we have the 14-day noticing and then that gives us 5 days to do any analysis of the information we receive, tweak the maps? I'm just wondering how you arrived at the 3 alternatives.
It is exactly based on that formula.
Okay. Thank you.
And there's some elbow space, but I wanted the Commission to realize that if we were to give the public an opportunity to respond to our trial maps, the June-July constraint allows us only to do 3 of those opportunities, given that time frame.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
Not a question, maybe a comment, and this I should have raised this in our technical advice in our outreach committee meeting. But this timeline, once again, I compliment you on your effort, includes all 4 maps, and these are the deadlines inclusive of all 4 maps. In reality and practicality, some maps will be less complicated than others. For example, the Board of Equalization maps will finish that probably with 4 districts a lot sooner. And then the senatorial maps may be a little less complicated than the assembly maps, and probably those will be less complicated than the congressional maps. But I see this as a framework, the worst case scenario for the Board of Equalization maps, which gives us a lot of leeway. And I see the driving deadline here in each date, each of these milestones is making certain that the congressional, which I think may be more complicated than the others, fall into place with. So I'm saying there's going to be some variation of what labor intensity occurs with each of the 4. And
that's probably something the Commission needs to discuss. I don't know how complex those various districts will be, but I'm sure the expertise at this Commission will have to discuss that.
But overall, this is an excellent framework to look at milestones so that we know that with all 4, we have to complete all 4 by these critical milestones.
Yeah. And I think the significance of this is that we have to start thinking in terms of the benchmark dates and the limited amount of time we have.
Chairman. I did want to chime in a little bit because, as a reminder, there is a requirement in the Act regarding the nesting of, or the attempt to nest as much as possible the districts. So we are, I believe under the text of the law, required to, or we should try to build Senate districts that are built on 2 assembly districts, and that the Board of Equalization districts also have to be built on subunits as well. But a point well taken in terms of distribution and maybe having a little easier time with some districts than others. And I think the overall point, I think, is a very good one.
Good. So I'm seeing that discussion beginning to happen already. That's very good. Okay. Any other questions on the timeline? All right.
Yes,
so then if you back up
Mr.
from...
Antai?
Yes.
Excuse me. Let me just make a couple of comments. There's various schools of thought as to the approach to drawing the lines. And one school of thought says that you should not really look at any districts as they're drawn, that you should really kind of look at the density of the population as a starting point, and then drawing around those, looking at county lines and trying to keep those as solid as possible. That's one school of thought. And then there's others where you would go to Board of Equalization districts and kind of like set those, and then go to the next level, and so on. But ultimately, this is where experienced map drawers and their expertise comes into play. Because not having done this before, it's difficult for us to try to guess what the best approach might be. So, just to and then the other my other comment is that it would be great if, as a commission working with the outreach committee, if we were to develop a product, perhaps by our next meeting, where we would have a day-to-day between now and April and August 15th that would, first of all, list the dates when we're going to have hearings. Secondly, list the locations of where those hearings are going to occur, and then that will provide the framework for us to kind of populate those with commissioner participation. So.
You're absolutely right. And we need to do that so that the public is on the same page as to when these events are going to happen. And that we have to do also working with CCP and Karen McDonald.
Commissioner Antai, I would just alert the Commission that this issue of nesting is really an interesting one and a complex one. And there's an excellent article in the statewide database website that points to the complexity of doing that. And it might be of value for us to at least get an understanding of what's involved in nesting.
I'm very pleased that we're getting up there. It's a healthy discussion. I can see we're ready to go on that. Any other comments so far? So if you oblige me, I'm going to continue. So between the release of the census data and our first trial map, we're probably going to be sitting at this dais looking at all types of map lines, alternatives. We're going to have Karen in front of us showing us, well, if you did this, you did that, da-da-da. We're going to have communities of interest saying, well, you should consider this, da-da-da. All of that's going to be happening between the release of the census data and our trial maps. And we're going to be going all over the state doing that. What was that?
There's a mysterious power in the building.
I think that was a good sign, right? Spirit is with us. So that's going to be a very intense time. We're going to be getting a lot of public testimony. And this is, I think, maybe the first crucial part where we're demonstrating to the community that we're really listening to them and taking their inputs. And then, prior to the release of the census data, to where we are now, February, it's what I consider activities are essentially educational material because we don't have the census data. So it's getting out there with our partners and sharing with them what we've done so far, why it's important for them to get involved, and taking advantage of all the points that were discussed yesterday with CCP and with Karen. But we're not actually doing any mapping at that point because we don't have the census data. So I don't think the commission would be actively involved during February, March, unless you want to. Now, individually, we're doing that now. I've done that several times in San Diego. I have several more lined up. And it's not about mapping. It's about, if you remember the chart, which is shown on this second to last page, what I will be doing is the non-mapping outreach and the non-mapping educational meetings between now and the census data release. And I would imagine many of you are currently doing that or will be doing that. And then we're also going to have our first formal one on March 26th, where we'll have a chance to see how CCP, Karen McDonald, and the Commission all work together, how that model works.
Mr. Claypool?
Just for a point of clarification, on the 26th, that meeting, I believe that Karen will actually not be participating in that one. What that will be is CCP handling that particular meeting for us, and that is, as discussed with Commissioner Galamos-Malloy, would be more of a meeting, the opportunity to meet with all of the different outreach partners who are currently have outreach processes in place. So it won't be actually an input meeting of a sort, and we're not anticipating taking any type of testimony that would go towards the mapping process. But I just want to make sure we knew that Karen will not be involved with that.
That would make sense. So that's the broad overview of what the time looks like. But it's a healthy reminder that we've got to get going. And it also tells us that we need to start plugging in some specific dates and making very clear what the roles are between the Commission and our consultants and our staff so that we're all on the same page on the limited amount of time and resources that we have.
Commissioner Yao.
This is a great schedule, number one. Number two is, besides the outreach program, I think there are other milestones that we need to decide or acknowledge. One of them I mentioned earlier, depending on where we start the mapping process, from the south, from the central, from the north, the map is going to look very different. I mean, the literature has basically told us that. So that perhaps would be one of the decisions that we need to make before we even start the trial map, okay? And that may involve some discussion, and that, if we acknowledge that to be a decision we need to make, then we need to have all the ducks lined up in terms of briefing from the experts and on and on. And maybe we should spend a few minutes along the way and, without any expert help, decide what other key decisions that we need to make to make sure we allow the sequential type of events to happen to do it. Like another example I would offer up is, before anybody can draw a set of draft map, we need to give the mapper or the person that's drawing the map a sense of some kind of priority as to whether compactness is more important than community of interest, or the other way around, okay? So that when he or she has to make a decision in that draft map, there's a set of guidelines to follow, okay? And this is more than just collecting data from the community, from the residents. I mean, the outreach program certainly is important and critical, but I think there are a lot of other decisions that we need to make along the way, and I think those need to be superimposed on top of the schedule that you have generated in order to make everything kind of mash together.
You're absolutely right, and I think Commissioner Filkins-Weber was alluding to that as well.
And yeah, so I would agree, and I think working with staff, one of the things we identified coming out of the legal advisory committee that we reported back was that one of the things we would like from the voting rights attorney is a training for all of us. And I think this format really helps us then plug those dates in, as Commissioner Yao was saying. So we should know by what time, we should figure out by what date, given this backwards schedule, we need to be trained so that even the criteria prioritization discussion is based on some legal training that we've all had as a commission. So I think that really we should think about these other dates that have to be plugged in that then flow from this schedule, given our needs around training and other things.
That's an excellent point. And so we're probably going to look to staff to help us plug those dates in and get the appropriate people in there.
Commissioner Antai, I think actually the prioritization of the various criteria is actually spelled out in the Voters First Act. So that's not something we need to discuss. That's very clear, the order that we need to consider the various criteria. What I do think we need to do is what Commissioner Aguirre pointed out, which is what is our overall approach? Are we going to start with Section 5 districts and in parallel start in the north and go down, or start in the middle and go out, or start with population? I mean, that I think is probably the philosophy of our general approach is probably the main thing that we need to set out.
I agree.
But my only inquiry is whether that would be premature to do that without having consultants that could make various recommendations. So you're not suggesting we do that today, but...
Not at all. I'm just suggesting that is a decision that we'll have to make in conjunction with our consultants.
Absolutely.
Another plug-in.
One additional thought. Using an Excel to do a schedule certainly is appropriate at this stage of the game, but there are a lot of good softwares out there like Microsoft Projects and on that allow one day to track the other days, and if you slip one day, they'll automatically look at the others for you. Like to recommend that we get someone to put this onto a Microsoft project or something equivalent to it, so that we really have a management tool instead of just something that's visual.
It is intended to be a management tool, a working sheet, so that we can all make adjustments and changes. So if there are better softwares than Microsoft Excel, then do we turn to staff to help us with that?
We certainly will be able to work with this schedule. I think once we put into place our consultants and our schedule, then we'll go ahead and once we have the funds, obviously, to buy the type of software we're talking about, which should be this next cycle, then we'll go ahead and put this on.
I think the request is more than that. I think having the software by itself is just a beginning step. You need somebody that can operate it and very efficient with it and set it up properly and on and on. So we may be able to find a volunteer, or we may be able to solicit help from the broader community, and maybe somebody will step forward and help us to get this thing going. If we try to learn that software from scratch and try to do it on that manner, we're not going to get there.
Actually, I believe that we have a staff person. You've already hired a staff person in Christina Shoup, who's quite capable. But certainly, if she weren't able to work with this software and do what you're asking, we would seek that additional help.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that project's probably really overkill for this, but, that's something that you guys can decide what's the best way to present it.
It's a great recommendation, Peter, and I think we'll effectively task staff, and I'm sure they'll get it done.
I'm sorry. We can go back and then plug in specific dates and events and arrange that so that we're all on the same page. And I think that's crucial, not only for this as a commission to operate in a sequential and timely manner, but also because the public needs to know that, so they can prepare and have adequate time to respond to designated times on which they know we're going to present or address certain issues. Does that make sense?
As far as what we need to accomplish today with regard to the schedule, can you identify any such requirements? For example, for the first block of outreach before the trial map, do we need to identify cities even though we don't have that data? Because if we wait until the end of February to do that, then you really only have March to make these things happen. But today, for example, San Francisco, Los Angeles, these bigger cities are easy targets, and perhaps we should kind of force something to happen. And
if it's the desire of the Commission to designate some cities by regions and frequencies during the educational component between now and the release of the census data, we can certainly have that discussion.
Yes. My suggestion was that we work with dates first, because it is the availability of the Commission based on the number of meetings that we're targeting during this period that will really drive what we're going to do. So my kind of hierarchy was that we look at dates first. Then once we have those dates, we can begin to determine who's available, what dates, and et cetera, so that at least for the educational workshop component, which we have tasked our consultants to work on, at least for that, we will be able to give them some dates so that then they have something to work with. So for my money, I think if we were to get to some dates, certainly because some of us are busier than others, it would provide an opportunity for you to kind of schedule yourself out. Now, once we have those dates between, for the educational component part at least, and this is what I'm suggesting that we accomplish that today, then we can think about locations, and if we want to go, as was suggested earlier, with focusing on the LA Basin area as being the highest concentration of population in the state, and then fanning out north, south, and east from there, that would be, something that we can determine later. But I think to start, we need to know, number one, how many workshops we're going to have, and secondly, what are those dates? Some of those are during the week. Some of those are weekends. Are we looking at every weekend to be as accessible as possible? Are we available to do evening meetings? Those things are, I think, real questions for real people who have real schedules, right? So, yes.
And then adding on to that, do we want CCP there? Do we want Karen there?
If maybe I can clear up, as I'm just as a board member a little confused from past meetings and past expert testimony. It seems like some of the lessons learned are that when it comes to date setting and outreach planning and things like that, we're advised to act with intention. And we've had several speakers talk about the importance of that. And I understand that a lot of what we've accomplished this week is arranging for consultant support. And from what I understood, we voted that the consultants are going to be putting together proposals with that, the data we're discussing in it, bring that to us, and then we're going to go ahead and have some reasoned data with which to make those decisions, plug them in, and run. I'm concerned about just picking things, kind of like when we decided to do 50 outreach meetings. It was a great idea. It was fantastic conversation, but ultimately it was in the face of a void of information. So I would just like to ask the outreach subcommittee if my understanding of what we're supposed to be expecting in 2 weeks is the opportunity to do much of this with an expert analysis.
Yeah, I think Commissioner Ward is absolutely right. All of yesterday's discussion with the consultants was how are they going to fit in and how they're going to coordinate and how they're going to bring the content together. So we need to tie those previous discussions together so there's a link instead of a disjointed discussion.
Chair Ward, may I? If I can refer you to that first block of scheduled outreach before the trial map, okay? It's a block off between February and March. If we wait for the consultant's report, that'll be the end of February. And if you make the 14-day announcement for the outreach meeting, the earliest day you can have it is mid-March, okay? So that gives you 2 weeks to accomplish everything that we want after we receive the data from the consultants and so on. Now, is it reasonable to, based on this set of schedule that's before us, to accomplish that 9 meeting in 2 weeks? Okay, so it's fine that we have all our ducks lined up before we move, but that pushes us into a corner that we have no options, and every decision involves a certain degree of risk. And what we're saying is we need to set some dates because this schedule is really pushing us to act. And it's a lot easier to cancel those dates if it doesn't happen, similar to what we try to do in Claremont. But if you wait until we have the information and the recommendation, you miss the entire, or you're likely to miss the entire schedule for the initial outreach activity.
Commissioner Pickens-Weber?
Thank you. I believe this could probably be easily answered by our consultants. I'm not under the impression that the educational workshops require the notice. They're not public hearings. So as I understand it, Corinne, it was late yesterday, but I believe we did pass a motion that she would be doing the educational workshops. So my vision, and of course she could correct us and answer this question very clearly, is that she probably could get started on the workshops in the areas of whatever she has decided that would be best, and then the outreach would go behind those workshops. And so the workshops don't require the notice, but if you had an idea of what answer to our question is what areas she might be starting on for the workshops, the first outreach meeting is probably going to follow right behind that. So that's how I see that our consultants are going to answer this question, I believe, rather than us trying to determine that schedule. So I don't think we have to ponder that, and I certainly appreciate Commissioner Yao's concern on that the possibility could be that we'd be pushing this timeline out, but since we've already tasked Ms. McDonald to do the educational workshops, I certainly leave it up to her to advise us as to her schedule. We have confidence in her, and then we could schedule the outreach by probably early March if she gets the workshops started. She says she's ready to go. So if she starts the workshops at the end of February, then the first outreach meetings would be probably in the areas where she had the workshops. But again, I think that that's my idea of how she's going to structure this for us, and we've tasked her to do it.
Mr. Claypool.
As I understood CCP and Karen's presentation, they were going to schedule 6 of those workshops around the regional centers. So that gives you location for 6. Then CCP had made a recommendation on Watsonville, and one more, or actually Karen and CCP had recommended Watsonville and North LA as additional sites, and then had recommended, and then CCP on their own had recommended one more site further north. So I believe, because the regional centers are already placed, that the 9 locations have been recommended to us, and I believe that another part of that component was that they were going to offer you a schedule of those of the dates that might work. possibly a good solution for this is to confirm the 9 locations through our subcommittee and then ask them to work through the subcommittee to see the commissioner availability so that we can have both the dates and the locations scheduled right after our meeting in Sacramento.
Yeah, and Chair, and that's exactly my point. Is they need to work around our availability. So on a weekly basis, let's say, let me put my DiGiulio hat on, right? Can we agree that we are least available Monday and Tuesday, maybe Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday? Can we agree that we are least available during those 3 days? If we do that, then we can go to CCP, and they are expecting us to communicate with them on Monday about any direction that the Commission would want to forward to them. And that would be, I think, a very good guideline that they should stay away from these days and look at Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and perhaps Sunday, right? So the other question is, are we available on Sundays? I understand that some of us are, and certainly the public would like to see us on Sunday. So can we agree that we are absolutely available on Sunday so that we can go to CCP and say, take Sundays too? You know. So anyway, all I'm saying is that we need to provide direction to our consultants so they're not totally in the dark. Because I can anticipate that when we talk with them on Monday, we're going to have a phone conference, that they're going to say, well, when are you guys available?
Vice Chair.
Commissioner Aguirre, I definitely sympathize with what position you're going to be in on Monday. I'm also looking ahead to when we can schedule our March business meeting, which needs to fall in there somewhere. I am saying this as a working mother and just cringing internally at what it really is going to mean for my life over the coming months. But I think we're reaching a point in our workflow where we need to be erring on the side of not scheduling things for our personal and professional lives outside of the Commission. And that's the reality of what it's going to take to get the job done. I do agree that it would be helpful for the consultants and helpful for all of us to minimize chaos in our outside lives if we could agree on some principles of what our preferred days are. But I'm not convinced, as I look at this timeline, that sticking to those principles is going to be what gets the job done. So I would say, let's agree on some principles, but the reality is if we have to have meetings on Mondays and Tuesdays to make this happen, then amongst ourselves, we have to come up with critical mass to be able to make those commitments happen. That's my perspective. And so I'm, at this point, as I look ahead to March and beyond, really resisting making myself available to outside commitments because of the commitment that we made when we were sworn in as commissioners here.
Yeah.
Commissioner Dye.
I totally agree with that, and I think we're really just going to have to try to clear our schedules and understand that some of us are not going to be as available as others, and as long as we have the minimum number of commissioners that, you know, we give our consultants as much flexibility as possible to schedule us. And then, of course, this is a reminder to everyone who hopefully has already filled in the unavailability calendar. I mean, that's what I think we should give to our consultants. So if you absolutely cannot be available, that should be reflected in the unavailability calendar. And otherwise, we're going to assume that you may be available.
If I may point the conversation quickly back to the subcommittee, just because at this point I'm unclear, what decisions or what can the panel provide you, provide the subcommittee to be able to conduct work this week?
I think we're good as it now stands. This is a healthy discussion because it is intended for you all to start thinking in terms of a very compressed sprint. We really are doing a sprint, and we don't have much time. So I think it's very important that we talk about how we're going to bring in training consultants, which is very crucial. It's important for us to talk about our scheduling. It's important for us to talk about what needs to be done between now and the census data release, what types of activities, and then what happens between the census data release and our dialoguing with the community when we come out with a final map. And then after that, what happens? What opportunities do we give to the communities to respond to our trial maps? And as long as we're thinking about those activities within literally 2 months time frame for each of those segments, then it gives us a very clear picture that we really need to get going.
Okay, I've got Commissioner Aguirre, then Commissioner Blanco, then Commissioner Raya, then Commissioner Yao, then Commissioner Galambos-Malloy. Commissioner Aguirre.
I'll be brief, and that is that that's the kind of decision that we need to make. On Monday, when we speak with our consultants, we're going to say, our schedule is totally open, and you can refer to what's online as far as availability is concerned. But once you choose those dates, then be assured that we will do our best to populate those dates with participants. All right.
Microphone.
Somebody's on. And based on yesterday's conversation with the consultants, we're now getting some ideas what those specific dates are.
Commissioner Blanco.
No, I think this is what we needed. I think this is great. In terms of our availability, I agree. I want us to remember, though, that even if we say we should make ourselves available Mondays and Tuesdays and any day, that we have to remember that for the communities that we're working with, that we have to think evenings. And so just another factor. So we may say we're available Mondays and Tuesdays, but we should be looking whenever possible at those days in terms of evenings when we get into the input and then taking out the trial maps. So you may be able to both work on Monday and go to an evening meeting, if that helps at all.
Commissioner Raya?
Thank you, but I think the other commissioners have covered my points of concern.
Thank you. Commissioner Yao.
I want to make sure that we are in agreement that we need to have the first meeting, wherever it is, whether it's in the evening or weekend, schedule so that we can make it happen in first part of March. In other words, if we have that meeting in first part of March, that basically will give us a month to take care of the outreach activity. This is more than just the educational thing. This is getting inputs from the public before we start drawing the map, which is the next milestone, which is called the data release. So in order for that to happen, to have the meeting in first part of March, we almost have to select the date and select the place in the next few days. So I want to get the commissioner to agree, or at least voice against it, saying that's unreasonable, and we're not going to do it that way. But if we're going to do it that way, then we need to make decisions in this meeting in order for that to happen.
I've got to put you in line. Oh, okay. Commissioner Yao, are you making a motion at this point?
I don't think a motion is necessary, but if such is what we need to decide on, I certainly would be willing to make one.
At this point, it seems like we're continuing to discuss
All right.
it. If you would like a decision
I would
made,
move that we immediately set dates for the first block of outreach meeting so that we can have the first one happen in the first part of in the month of March.
That vote requires a second. Oh, not hearing a second at this time.
I'll second that.
Okay, so we do have a motion on the floor and a second. Commissioner Baraba.
My impression was we just directed the subcommittee on outreach to, on Monday, work with the consultant group to pick out the set of dates for these meetings. And we got to learn how to live with the subcommittees. Otherwise, we're going to be at this for a very, very long time, not doing anything.
No disagreement with that approach, but I want to make sure that we get the announcement out so that we can have a meeting in the first part of March. That's all. I'm not picking the dates or picking the places, but I sense that there are commissioners that want to wait until the next meeting to look at the plan and then decide on a date. And we were to do that. The earliest day we can have any kind of meeting is middle of March, because of the 14 days advance notice. And I'm not talking about the education component. I'm talking about the input process, the input data collection. And if we decide today that we're willing to accept the risk of doing all 9 meetings in 2 weeks, then we can do that. But I'm not sure that we're sensitive to that fact and we're willing to move in that direction.
Commissioner Dye.
Commissioner Yao made an important point. So I think really here, I don't know if this requires the full commission, but we're essentially, I think, that what we need to do is delegate this to the outreach committee to, after the discussion with the consultants on Monday, and making sure our consultants have access to our unavailability calendar for them to set up a schedule, and that we just need to go with that as a starting plan.
As a panel member, I'd like to get in line and just state that, again, we did refer back to the subcommittee to see what information they required to move forward with all the action items that we passed yesterday. And the subcommittee, who's been meeting and tackling this, has reported that they need no further action taken at this time. Commissioner Filkins-Rober, did you need?
Just one other point. I wholeheartedly agree with it going back to subcommittee. We do have a calendar issue. Just, gentlemen, if you do take this back, this hasn't been worked out since we've just been working with Google Calendars. Right now, the way that Christine has it up there, it has it, an individual commissioner is not available, and so it'll just say unavailable. But since we're breaking it down as far as time, I don't want the subcommittee to assume that I'm not available at night on a day that I might not be available. So we might need to take a look at our unavailability again, because if this calendar is going to be used for Monday, I can specify evenings, which I didn't, but I don't want this commission to assume that because I put myself unavailable on a particular day that I'm not available at night, because I am, more than likely. I mean, all my nights are pretty much free except for city council. But other than that, I think we might need to work that little detail out on the calendar, and I just want to bring that to everybody's attention because we don't have it specified for evenings yet.
Can I just, actually you can, question? It's about the calendar. So actually, if you look at it, when it's in solid orange, that's when it's all day. When it says unavailable and it's not solid, that's when people have written in the hours during which they're not available. So if you go to some of these unavailable that are not blocked out in deep orange, then it does list the hours during which you're unavailable. The other ones are full day unavailability.
As Chair, I'd like to just, at this point, if we can go ahead and bring Google Calendar questions to Christina, who's running that project. I understand training's coming out, and she's trying to work it out, so we can pass all this to her. Mr. Claypool, you have the microphone.
I just wanted to just have some clarification from the Commission. As I understand Commissioner Yao's concern about wanting to schedule these meetings as quickly as possible for the outreach and those 8 meetings, those 9 meetings, as I understood it yesterday, and correct me if I'm wrong, those meetings would possibly include commissioners, possibly not, but we could, possibly not, but we could, if they included commissioners, have that schedule, start with that schedule now, because as I said, we know where those locations were scheduled to be. And so we can look at that plan and we can say, okay, going through the subcommittee, let's work where they're at and have that in place. So I'm not as concerned with that. But when we start talking about the actual input meetings, we have another issue. And that issue is we are now going to a competitive bid. And that competitive bid is going to require that we go through that process before we can bring on whoever our ultimate line drawer is going to be, and that person, as I understand it, is going to be very instrumental in putting together how they wish to see that information move forward. So I believe that we need to separate the two issues. We have outreach, which we can very much plan and have a solid plan for on your schedule, but I think it would be premature to start thinking in terms of input until we know who the person is going to be that we are sending that information to.
Okay, at this point we have a motion on the floor and a second. Mr. Yao, would you please restate the motion before we open it up to the public and then vote?
The motion is direct staff and the committee to do whatever posting necessary to make sure that we start the input meeting at the first part of March.
Can I have the original motion read back?
Motion by Commissioner Yao to direct staff and committee to set and post dates of meetings, the input meetings, immediately for the 1st of March.
Was that the original motion that was made and seconded?
Well, the original motion was to for the committee to set meetings for the 1st of March.
That was what I recalled as well. So the motion that's on the floor, as I understand it, is for the committee to set dates at this time for meetings in March, and that's what was seconded. So that's what we need to vote on at this time. The committee was his words.
The subcommittee.
Subcommittee.
Okay, well, we intended to do that anyway. Right?
So can we please get a read back of the motion on the floor?
I'm sorry, the original motion?
The motion that was seconded.
Okay. To direct the subcommittee to set dates for the meetings immediately for the 1st of March.
Commissioner Yao?
As I stated earlier, I don't think a motion is necessarily required, but I do want public acknowledgement that notice will go out so that the first outreach meeting can happen in the first part of March. I think that's really the intent. And because prior to that, I heard comments from the full commission stating that we want to get the consultants' input and then decide on when and how to set up these meetings. And my counter argument at that point is the earliest opportunity we can get that data is end of February. Assuming everything goes well, we set the date and time. It'll be middle of March, and that'll only give us 2 weeks to make all the input meeting happen. And I think that would be an impossible schedule to meet. So the whole intent is to make sure that we initiate the outreach meeting in the first part of March.
Excellent, Mr. Yao. Fantastic points. Then can I understand that you would like to withdraw that motion, being that you see it as unnecessary?
I would be happy to withdraw the motion.
Okay, and we'll consider staff directed appropriately and direct the conversation back to the subcommittee.
Yes, in that spirit, we'll do that.
Yeah, and
sorry.
Just a clarification for understanding. And so we will consult with our consultant on Monday. We will say that the schedule is open, that there is a desire to begin in early March. We will ask them to give us that date ASAP. Once we have that date, we're going to give it to our staff so that they'll notice it 14 days hence.
Absolutely. That's how I understand it. Just one more point of clarification. We are referring to outreach meetings to the public and not input meetings.
I think we should clarify and start using the terminology our consultants have been using, which is educational workshops versus the public input meetings. So I just want to point out to the Commission, I understand the urgency, and we are up against a physical problem with the calendar here, but I don't see given that we voted for a competitive bid process, as Mr. Claypool pointed out, how we can set up meetings when we don't have our technical consultant on board and may not have that consultant on board until the end of our meeting in Sacramento. So I think it's fine to try to get something noticed, but I think we need to be realistic that those meetings probably will not happen the 1st of March. And if we have to do, 9 public input meetings in the second half of March, we're going to conquer, and we're going to divide and conquer. I mean, only 3 of us have to be at any one of those meetings. It is, I think, actually possible to do that. So I just want to hopefully alleviate the tension people are feeling, the pressure.
Excellent. Being that this item's staff's received some direction and some action on this item, I'd like to call a 5-minute bio break, and we'll come back to it and finish up.